This is Anarchast.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. We have a really interesting guest coming on today. His name's Ken Krawchuk, and he's just north of Philadelphia, and he's actually running for governor in Pennsylvania. A very interesting guy. He's got a lot of very, very libertarian views, and I hope you stick around for the whole interview. I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. And just to lead this off, anytime I have someone running for office in the U.S. on, I'd like to explain anarchy, because what's going to happen is Ken's going to be running for governor, and some person's going to see him on an anarchist show, and they're all going to say he's an anarchist and never vote for him because he wants to destroy things and blow up buildings. So I just want to explain very briefly at the very top here, for anyone who doesn't know, anarchy is a totally peaceful ideology. All it means is that you don't want to have a ruler and you don't want anyone to rule over you, and that means you don't want anyone to use violence against you. And therefore, a true anarchist is a person who believes completely in non-aggression, in not initiating force against others. And so for this reason, I'm not going to ask Ken how he became an anarchist, because I don't want too many people to blow it out of proportion that he is one. I'm just going to ask him, Ken, how did you become a libertarian?
That's a good question. Now, I was a Democrat for 20 years. I grew up thinking I used to be able to use your means for my ends. And then when I was in my early 30s, somebody handed me a copy of Atlas Shrugged, and the rest, as they say, is history. The ideas in that transformed me from a lifelong Democrat into how many times I've run for office now? 8 times running for office under the Libertarian banner. And when I do, I always run under the same general idea. The idea that your life is yours, that your property is yours, that you have the inalienable right to live your life your way without interference, provided only you respect the rights and property of others. Now, we were talking earlier, and you said, oh, that's anarchy. No, you can't call that anarchy. That's called respecting other people's property, other people's lives. And I call it agoran. If anything, I call myself an agoran libertarian. Because if you go to people and say, oh, I'm an anarchist, like you said, they think you're a bomb thrower. The example I like to use is bean curd. Nobody likes to eat bean curd. Oh, but do you like tofu? Oh, yeah, tofu's pretty good. So there's a matter of packaging here. So when I go out on the campaign trail, I ask people, who thinks they should be able to live their life their own way without interference? And every hand will go up. And that's what it is. That's libertarianism.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's all about communication. And unfortunately, a lot of people still do think that anarchy is a bad thing, and they have all these misconceptions about it. And that's why we have to use different words and different ways of communicating. And I should point out that I rarely even like talking to anyone involved in the political process, but I do support anyone who's really trying to move liberty forward, and that's what Ken's trying to do. And one really interesting about Ken is he actually rewrote or did a parody of the entire book Atlas Shrugged, called Atlas. What is it? Atlas
Snubbed.
Snubbed. I always forget the snubbed. Yeah. Very interesting. And maybe you could just tell us in a few minutes or less what that was about and why you wrote it.
Well, I ran for governor in 2002, and as you may know, Ayn Rand is the philosophical matriarch of the Libertarian Party. And in fact, it all centers around that one key line in John Galt's speech, that you cannot initiate the use of force against others. In fact, to be a member of the Libertarian Party, a card-carrying member, you need to sign a pledge that you will not initiate the use of force. Now, Atlas Shrugged is one of my favorite books. And as a high-profile libertarian candidate, I found myself in a position on the campaign trail where I had to defend Ayn Rand's philosophy to the public at large. But some parts of her philosophy are just plain indefensible. So it was after the election, I said, I've got to come out with some kind of a rebuttal to this. So that's what I did. I started writing this book. I call it a pastiche parody sequel. It's a pastiche because I take pieces of Atlas Shrugged, and I like to take the words of one of her good guys and put them in the mouth of a bad guy, plausibly, and take the words of her bad guys and put them in the mouth of her good guys, again, plausibly. So it's a pastiche because I take pieces, like a quilt, a patchwork quilt. It's also a parody because obviously I'm pointing out those flaws in objectivism, or all those different areas where if you cite along the lines that objectivism draws, there are some unintended, plainly foreseeable consequences. So it's a bit of a parody as well. And it's a sequel. It's right up against the edge of Atlas Shrugged. The end of Atlas Shrugged, Eddie's abandoned in the middle of a desert on a stalled train. Chapter 1 opens, Eddie's still sitting there on that stalled train. So it's a pastiche parody sequel. But the reason I wrote it is not for some philosophical idea, but rather to present political solutions to things that Ayn Rand couldn't even talk about. Like, what do you do with the poor? Her idea of the poor is, oh, just let them starve, you know, maybe charity's okay. Very, very cold-hearted. And we libertarians get tarred with that cold-hearted opinion. So part of the reason for the book was to eliminate that. Another reason was to show how you could run a court system without resorting to force. In other words, to use Agoran principles, letting you live your life your way without interference, and still run a court system, a regulatory system, a banking system, even something as mundane as driver's licenses, and we'll talk about that later. So my idea was to get all these ideas down. I sum it all up under one phrase. I call it the separation of society and state, because there's just so many things that the state is doing, like taking care of the poor, taking care of the old people, regulations, all these things that properly belong in the realm of society. But how do we do that in an Agoran point of view where you're not initiating the use of force? That's what my book's about, Atlas Snubbed. And I can go into a lot more, matter of fact, I will go into a lot more detail about it.
That's great, and it's really interesting because so many people have been on Anarchast, and they've said that one of the books that really turned them was Atlas Shrugged. And you said yourself that you were a Democrat and that turned you into a Libertarian. Yet many people have kind of gone against it a little bit now and said that it wasn't really a complete, full picture of what true libertarianism could be like. And of course, Ayn Rand has her own following in something called objectivism, which I still don't fully understand. It seems a little bit like a cult to me. But it is interesting that this book has awakened so many people, and at the same time, a lot of people that are awoken, they kind of turned away from it a little bit, at least some of her ideas, not all of them, of course. Her main ideas were great, but she had some other sort of wonky ideas that didn't really fit with a truly libertarian idea. And of course, even the Ayn Rand Institute today is quite war hawk, and they're really into war, which of course is not a libertarian ideal. And so it's very interesting. And so maybe you can just tell us a little bit about maybe some of the characters in the book or some of the progressions that happened, and just sort of explain to us how they resolve some of their situations.
So Eddie Willers finds himself stranded in a small town, and somehow he winds up as the leader of the town, where people keep coming to him with problems. But Eddie won't use the initiation of force to solve those problems. So the problems, they fall into three general areas. I'd like to touch upon each one at a time. First one is in the area of the courts. What happens is there's a bandit in town running around, and they finally catch the guy. But the townsfolk aren't sure what to do with him. As you may know, at the end of Atlas Shrugged, society has collapsed. There's nothing left. There was riots in the street, hunger riots, and there's no government left at all. So Eddie is left with the task of putting something back together. So the question is, what do we do with this bandit? So obviously, Eddie, being the honest guy, he's not going to initiate the use of force. He says, well, let's find out if he's really the bandit. And he calls together a court. Now, there are no judges in town. Somebody says, oh, you ought to be judge. And of course, Eddie, he's Eddie. He doesn't have a whole lot of self-confidence. He sits in the back and he says, well, all right. So what he does, he just calls together a jury. Just picks 7 people out of the audience, says, all right, you guys are the jury. And of course, the bandit, who's really big with procedure, he says, wait a minute, objection. I get to question them. I get to reject the ones I don't like. And Eddie's like, you mean you want to stack the jury? The guy says, he's like, no, you can't stack the jury. We'll just take 7 people, no questions asked. And then they start doing the questions. And the bandit over and over does procedural this, procedural that. And Eddie keeps saying, well, how can you do that? There's no right. So in the end, they find him guilty, to make a long story short. And at the end, Eddie says, well, you know, I thought of a good sentence. I'm going to sentence you to work in the power plant because we're trying to restore power here. Because you're a smart guy. We'll teach you how to work a power plant, and we rehabilitate you. So that's your sentence. Do you accept it? And the bandit says, what do you mean, do I accept it? Well, I don't have any power over you. I'm just this guy. So do you accept the sentence, yes or no? And the bandit's like, well, what if I don't accept it? Said, well, if you don't accept it, that means that you really don't accept our courtroom or our system of justice here. So in the future, you can't call on it. So he says, oh, so if somebody robs me or something like that, I can't call on the courts? That's right. You're outside of the justice system. So if you accept the sentence and you fill your sentence, then you're still here, and the courts will still protect you. And if you don't, well, that's it. So the bandit, of course, says, all right, I accept the sentence, and he lives happily ever after. Later on, there's another guy's like, I don't accept your sentence. He walks out of the courtroom. By the time he gets home, his apartment is ransacked. All his stuff is stolen. There's nothing he can do about it because he can't call in the judicial system. So there it is in a nutshell. The accused person, it's all jury-driven. The judge does nothing except act as a referee, saying, jury, you have any questions? Accused, do you have any questions? And that's all it is. And the accused, if he's found guilty, can accept or not accept the sentence. So that's freedom. There's no forcing in the court system at all. That's it. That's the court system in a nutshell. I should stop there and let you ask questions.
Yeah, sure. No, I really like it. And the thing that really excites me about a different world other than the status world and a voluntary world is there's so many different possible ways that things could work, and they're all so much better. And it's so much healthier too, like what you just said about, you can accept it or not. Like that's so much different than, you're forced to accept this. We've got all these guys with guns here. You're forced to accept it, but you have to suffer the consequences of your own actions. And there'd be so many different ways that people would resolve disputes in an actual voluntary society compared to a status society, and it'd be so much healthier because a lot of these criminals of today, the main reason that a lot of them are criminals is usually because they've been so downtrodden by the system itself. Their families have been torn apart through the welfare system. They've been forced into these public indoctrination camps, public schools for 12 years. They didn't want to go. They're angry. They're broke. Their families separated mostly because of status things like welfare and things like that, and of course central banking, which robs them through inflation. And so there wouldn't actually be a ton of criminals, I don't believe, in a truly unstatus world, in a non-state world, because there'd be so much more prosperity. Of course, if you could keep all of your money you earn, you'll have a lot more money, and everyone would have a lot more money. There'd be much less incentive to actually go around and actually steal something from someone else. But there'd still be a few people who would do that. But if they were actually involved in a society that was like this, where they went in and they were like, hey, you don't have to if you don't want to accept this ruling, they'd be like, wow, this is such a great, nice society. They'd almost be like, as opposed to today where you have like NWA with fuck the police and everyone hates the police, and for good reason, because the police are just terrible in most cases. Whereas, and that really just goes through all of society. And of course, as well, and just to expand on that, a government itself is violence and theft. And so when you have a society based on violence and theft, it's only normal to see a lot of violence and theft throughout the society. Whereas if you have a society that's much more caring and much more open and less forceful and less violent, you're going to have a lot less violent people.
Yes, and I make that very point in my book, is that because there are so many opportunities for honest work, prosperity just comes about. It's also one of the areas where Eddie winds up doing some regulation because they start running low on dollar bills, like physical dollar bills. So what he does is he remonetarizes the entire monetary system by bringing back silver and gold. He's in Nevada, so there's silver around, and he actually sets up with him and a banker. They just decide to do it. They say, well, starting tomorrow, for every paper dollar you have, we'll give you 3 cents in silver. And he just does a reverse system whereby they get rid of the paper money and shift over to a solid money system. Actually called Walter Williams to ask his advice on how to remonetize the system. So all that's in the book as well.
Yeah, that's a whole other issue, of course, is this fiat currency system we currently live under, and how do we transition to a better system. And, of course, Bitcoin has come out now, which really changes the game, and it's going to be very interesting. That's why a lot of free market people are so excited about Bitcoin. Is a lot of people have this question, how do we go back to a gold standard or silver standard, or even just go back to gold and silver being money? And it's fairly difficult. It's not going to be easy to do, and as you pointed out, whereas Bitcoin has sort of just moved beyond all that now, and it's really exciting, the potential and possibilities. And that's what excites me so much about anarchy, is that all these things are possible all of a sudden, and there's so many people in the free market who'll come out with solutions, and it'd be so dynamic and so exciting. The whole world would just almost just turn into such a better place very quickly.
I agree. If you stop the forcing, If you're not forced to accept this circus money that we have now, then regular money can take over. And you may be excited about Bitcoin, but I like the idea of going into silver and gold, because my personal opinion is Bitcoin is just another unbacked currency that's going to pop at some point. While I do hold some Bitcoin, I don't believe in it. But in my book, we wind up with two alternate currencies side by side. There's still the old paper dollars trading at 3 cents on the dollar, and of course there's real silver trading at $1 on the dollar.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying gold and silver couldn't come back as money, but I think it wouldn't be as easy as a digital currency would in today's world. And I think I would hope that the free market would come up with all sorts of solutions, including gold and silver, and maybe even digital gold and silver, where you actually you have a credit card that's actually backed by gold in a vault somewhere or something like that. So it's a lot easier. And yeah, it's incredibly fascinating and interesting. This is the thing about statism that's so bad, is it's so boring, and it never changes. Like we've been under this dollar system the way it is today since 1913, and of course since 1971 when they finally took the last gold vestiges away from the dollar, and nothing ever changes, and it just gets worse and worse. There's nothing dynamic like in the free market, whereas in the free market there'd be just constantly entrepreneurs and people coming up with new solutions. Some would fail, like you said, Bitcoin could fail, we don't know, and some wouldn't, and that would free market be incredibly dynamic. Be a little bit of a roller coaster, which I guess that's why I think that some people still cling to statism, because they kind of like that we're just all enslaved and we're all impoverished, but it's fairly calm, like fairly, the state killed 200 million people in the 20th century, but it appears fairly calm. It appears to be fairly stable, even though it's not. And I think they cling to that appearance of stability.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jeff, you're using the word statism and state a couple of times. What I like to do when I'm out on the campaign trail is I don't use those kind of words, because they like saying anarchy. It tends to scare people and put them off. Instead, I talk about the initiation of force. One thing I really love when I'm out on the campaign trail, I do a lot of schools, and I'll always ask, I say, how many people think you should be able to live your life your way as long as you don't bother other people? Raise your hand. Every hand in the room goes up, and I'm like, hey, you're all libertarians. And the teachers look daggers at me. So if you present it as not initiating the use of force, everybody agrees with you. But you say, oh, do you believe in the state? Well, then they start thinking about traffic lights and FEMA and things like that. You don't want them thinking along those lines. You want them to be thinking along helping other people, not hurting other people. And that's how I've been coming at it. And that's how Eddie comes at it in my book. So his whole court system is based on the fact that he's not going to be a judge. He's not going to force you. You can make your own choice in the situation. And the most common sentence that's handed down there for bad criminals is exile. They kick you out of town. There's actually a secondary town that's set up outside where all the bad guys go and they hang out. So it's not as savory a place. And that's going to be a sequel to my book.
That'll be interesting. And yeah, when you actually let the free market function and you actually have all voluntary transactions, there's so much possibilities, and yeah, you could have this whole city of just outlaws, and they can all just rob each other until they're all dead or whatever. It's just amazing, the possibilities, and you're totally right about terminology. And now I'm different than you. I'm not a politician, so I don't need to coach my words too much.
I'm not a politician either. I haven't broken a promise yet. You call me a politician. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
Well, you still need to get votes to get in to do some of these things you want to do, so you have to be a little bit more careful with your words, whereas I don't care. And so, but you're totally right, and that's great information and great ideas for people about how they can use these terms. So you don't necessarily have to go up to people in your community and say, let's all become anarchists, because they'll be all confused and all that sort of thing. But just do what Ken said, just say, hey, do you all believe that we should not use violence against other people? And everyone, except for maybe one person out of 1,000, and then you pretty much know who the sociopath in your town is, will put their hands up. And then you say, well, that just means then you don't believe in a violent government, and you can kind of start from there. But it's all different ways of communicating these values to people and these ideas, and it's I think they're all very important.
Okay, so there's the first side of the book, the court system. So here's a different way to do it without any violence at all. Doesn't need an overseeing government at all. Second thing I wound up describing in my book is how to handle regulations. And the way it starts is that there's some orphans who come into town. Of course, the world has collapsed. There's all sorts of refugees wandering the streets. So there's a young girl and she's riding this battery-powered cart through town, and she's scaring the horses, almost running people over, and people are coming to Eddie saying, Eddie, what are we going to do about this girl? She's almost running people down. And the local policeman says, do you want me to lock her up? And Eddie's like, no, no, you don't want to lock her up. Because, of course, Eddie's a good guy. He's not going to initiate the use of force. He says, there's got to be something we can do. Can we bring her parents in? No, she's an orphan. She doesn't have any parents. 12-year-old. What are you going to do with a 12-year-old? So they try and come up. Eddie comes up, and again, I'll cut right to the chase. There's a lot of ins and outs on this. What Eddie comes up with instead is a way of riding herd on the bad people without inconveniencing the good people. Because there's a priest in town who suggests to Eddie, why don't we bring back the driver's license, and then you could take it away from her. And Eddie's like, oh, no, no, that's the worst idea possible. Because why should I go to you, saying to the priest, why should I go to you? You ride your horse responsibly. Why should I saddle you with a driver's license? And the priest says, but how are we going to control her behavior? And Eddie says, why don't we turn it on its head? Instead of giving her a driver's license, everybody a driver's license, why don't we just take her and give her a can't drive license? Because obviously she's not respecting the rights and property of others by driving her car like that. So what we're going to do is give her a can't drive license. If we catch her driving a car after that, we put her in jail for a night. We catch her doing it again, 2 nights, just to teach her a lesson. So the courts bring her in and say, excuse me, you're not respecting the rights and property of others. You knocked down this guy. He wound up in the hospital from what you did. You've now initiated force against him. So now we as a society will take you into court. Your sentence is you get a can't drive license. Do you accept it, yes or no? And of course you accept it. Everybody accepts the sentences in town after a while. They know better than to say no. But the can't drive license winds up getting expanded. There's another guy who winds up shooting his gun off in town too often, and you know, it rains bullets every now and again. He gets a can't carry license because he's not being responsible with his firearm. There's a miner in the outside of town who's polluting the stream. Now he's trespassing on everybody downstream by polluting the stream, so he gets a can't mine license. So there are all these can't licenses that are handed out to people who are being an idiot in one way or another. So again, it's not forcing people. It's not me coming to you and say, Jeff, you got to have a driver's license. It's, Jeff, you got to get a permit before you can mine, or whatever it is. I'm assuming that you know what you're doing, that you're an honest guy, that you're going to live your life properly. And it isn't until you step over that line and start harming other people, then we bring you into court, look at the facts, and the jury decides yes or no, do you deserve your can't license. And it's only for a period of time, 6-month can't license, 1-month can't license, whatever it may be. So that's how we control the behavior of people who are just not quite criminal, but not quite good. And also that works with one of the bankers in town. He starts practicing fractional reserve, but he doesn't tell anybody. So what happens is they set up, well, I guess I'm getting ahead of the game. I have to get parenthetical before I get into that. I should stop and let you talk about can't licenses for a second.
No, it's interesting. I think there's so many interesting ways that the market can deal with these things. They're so much better, and a bit of what you're saying there is not that Bush doctrine, attack them before they attack you sort of a thing. That's sort of a lot of what the government does. Is, well, there is some people who drive drunk and they kill people sometimes. So therefore, we're going to pull over every single person in the city every day and make sure they're not drunk, which is assuming that they're all criminals, they're all bad people. Whereas you do actually have to let some bad things happen sometimes. That's just the way life is. Some people are going to make some mistakes, and you can't. In my opinion, well, you can, and that's what we're seeing in the U.S. and places around the world. They're trying to make everyone be a criminal and assume everyone's a criminal, and then you just have to prove you're not if you want to be able to live your life, which is not a very healthy way at all to live, and you end up living in the police state that we have today. Yep,
that's right. So I turn that notion on its head. The only people that we hassle are the people who are the bad guys. And the good guys, they can live their life their way without interference, provided only they respect the rights and property of others. And it keeps coming back to that. Now, let me touch on the third thing. We talked about the courts. We've talked about regulation. And I want to come back to regulation because there are other aspects to that. But the third one, and the big one here in America today, is welfare. Welfare state is huge. And the numbers that I use are, look at the federal budget. It's about $16 trillion. Excuse me. That's the debt. There's big numbers here. If you look at the federal budget, it's about $3.5 trillion. If you look at the cost of the welfare state, and that would be Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all that stuff, is about $2.2 trillion, about 60% of the federal budget. If you look at federal revenues, they're about $2.3 trillion. So virtually every dollar coming in the federal door is going out for welfare. Everything else, defense, the White House, NASA, Amtrak, that's all borrowed money. We can't continue this way, because if we do, well, it's going to bankrupt us. Because people are getting older, Medicare is going to cost more, Social Security is going to cost more, we know that. So we have to come up with some way of taking care of all of these people. Now, I'm sure you're going to be quick to point out, anarchy would find a way. That was one of the problems I had with anarchy in the beginning, because I would ask Bob Shea, I'd say, Bob, how is it going to do this? He says, oh, anarchy would handle it. Not your way, not my way, but some way. It's like, no, no, no. I'm going to plan. I want to see how it's going to work. And that's what I laid out in my book. And the central idea to handle that is the separation of society and state. Because the state is taking on all these societal functions. Medicare, Medicaid, taking care of the poor, taking care of the sick, taking care of the old. They're societal functions. The purpose of government, the only purpose of government, is to defend the rights and property of the citizens. That's it. So by separating society and state, what we can do is get all that feel-good stuff into a separate entity. And that's what I did. That's in my book. Eddie sets up a completely separate entity he calls society. And it looks just like government. It's got a president, it's got Congress, it's got courts and everything. But the key difference is that society does not have the coercive power of taxation. And that's key. Because if society, they could pass Social Security Act, but they could not garnish your wages to pay for it. They could have public education, but they couldn't pass a property tax to pay for it, because that's theft. Any of those taxes would be theft. Any money that they want to spend for their programs would have to be done exclusively with donated funds, with voluntary contributions. And that's what happens in my book. All these refugees are coming into town. They need help. It's a mess out there in the world. They're lucky they survived this long. What are we going to do to help them? That's what Eddie does. He creates society. People run for the various positions in society, president of society, the senator in society, the representatives in society, and they pass not laws, but guidelines, because they have no force of law. Society has no coercive powers at all. So they can say, all right, we want a Social Security program. We want something to help these orphans who came into town. We think it's going to cost so much money. There are so many people in town. We divide it up. Your share is $10. Oh, only one person in 10 gives? All right, your share is $100. And that's it. So what they could do is they could set up on an organized basis voluntary charity where the people who care about the downtrodden, care about what's going on with them, they can sit there and have a direct say in what's going on. And the people who want to contribute, they can. People who don't, they don't. And that all works into the equation. So we have a safety net for the very needy, for the orphans, for the old people, whoever it may be, just by separating society and state. And that's the theme of my governor campaign this year. There's more information on that on my website at kenk.org. But separation of society and state, that's what I'm pushing for. Here in Pennsylvania, it's worse. 80% of our budget, our state budget, is dedicated to giveaway programs. And there's no other plan out there on the table except the separation of society and state, which can address that and keep it from bankrupting Pennsylvania and the nation. So I'll stop there and give you a chance to get a word in edgewise. I talk a lot.
Sure, no, you don't have to let me get too many words in. I like our guest to do most of the talking and lets me just sit here and drink wine and smoke cigarettes and enjoy. But I do have to say that it's amazing how much charity there is in the free market world. So much charity. And of course, if we didn't have all this wastage of funds, so many people would have so much more money. And I have actually a personal anecdote. I was here in Acapulco there was some really bad floods in this region a few months ago. And my wife, who's lived in this region for, her family's lived here for centuries, she said, you know, about an hour from here, it's really bad. Down by where the river was, an entire community just got wiped out. Just everything's gone. The river went up about 50 feet or something. It was a crazy amount and wiped out an entire town. And I said, oh, that's terrible. Like, how can we help? And she said, well, they have nothing. They have no food, no water right now, no medical supplies. And we went out there, and there was no sign of government whatsoever. And I was actually asking people, I said, have you seen anyone from the government come out here to help you? And everyone was just, they were very in shock. All they could do was just shake their head. And I put on the internet, I said, well, we're going to raise some money here to help these people. And we actually set up an anarchist rescue fund, and we had it's about $10,000 donated, mostly through Bitcoin, by the way. That $10,000 buys a lot down here. We had pickup trucks full of food, full of water, full of medical supplies, and we really helped to help the people in that community immensely. And even at the end, and this took a week or two to fully help them out of the emergency situation, there was still no sign of government, no sign of anything. And so it's sort of a bit of a, this is the thing with government, is they say they're going to do all these things, but it rarely turns out to be the case, as we saw in New Orleans in the Superdome. It was just a terrible situation. So a lot of people say, well, we need government for charity and for emergencies, but in most cases, the government really doesn't do much in those situations. In fact, it's usually private people. And for example, in New Orleans, you saw Walmart truck after Walmart truck, so this is a private enterprise, pulling up with donated food and supplies, and where there was no FEMA or anybody. Actually, the FEMA camps, FEMA offices were closed due to the weather during that period of time. So a lot of these things that people think the government's there for, it's actually just an illusion, and it's unfortunate because the free market, if we were unbridled or unstrapped or de-enslaved from all this taxation and bureaucracy, and that's actually the bureaucracy that destroys most of the wealth, many people are very giving people, and you can actually see that with the American people. Whenever there's a major problem like the tsunami in Japan, you see hundreds of millions of dollars being donated, and you can only imagine how much more would be donated if people were actually had a lot more of their own wealth that they could actually keep and create without the government actually destroying it.
Yep, I agree with that completely, and I make that point in my book. But another point I make, and some people who criticize my approach, is that when you set up a separate society, it's its own organization, and it has no coercive powers at all. But since it's a larger society, it can do a more complete, disciplined approach to what's going on with helping out people. So there aren't any people falling between the cracks. So that way they can set up a program, just like government has done, to set up people who are poor, people who need education, people who are old, people who need drugs. And there are programs for each one of those different things. But with society, with the society that I'm setting up here, it's done on a disciplined fashion. So that way you can be sure that people aren't going to fall between the cracks. And if you feel somebody is falling between the cracks, well, you can run for a position in society's House of Representatives. I'm sure Sally Struthers would love to be out there doing stuff like that. And that way, we make sure we get everybody. And that's one of my criticisms of just plain old anarchy, anarchistic anarchy, is that there'd be a lot of people falling between the cracks. Like you did one thing, somebody else might be doing another thing, another person doing a third thing. But I guarantee you there's some fourth area that you guys are not looking at. So if society itself were to be organized and disciplined, saying, here's how we handle these crises, kind of like a voluntary FEMA, I know it sounds like a contradiction in terms, but kind of like a voluntary FEMA, that way you'd be sure of not letting people fall between the cracks, and your safety net would have much, much, much smaller holes in it, and fewer people would fall through. Now, you said something else, which taps directly into something I do on the campaign trail. And this happens all the time. You mentioned about the waste in bureaucracy, about when you give money. I did this on national television the first time. I was running against Ed Rendell for governor of Pennsylvania, and he said, we've got to get more federal dollars here in Pennsylvania. And I said, Ed, do you know what happens when you send $1 to Washington? The first thing that happens to that dollar, a lot of it vanishes in the bureaucracy. And this is what comes back to the state. But the state, of course, has its own bureaucracy. And this is what comes back locally. But when it comes back locally, it doesn't go to you. It goes to your political buddies instead. They play politics with your money. You're lucky if you get a dime on the dollar back, and it probably doesn't go to you anyway. If you kept that money locally, you could help 10 times as many people.
Hey, isn't that illegal, destroying a...
You know, Mike Fisher, the Republican, said that actually on national television there. And he went to the Secret Service, and he said, Ken's tearing up dollar bills. You know, you got to arrest this guy. And they're like, Mike, get a life. he did a press conference and called for me to be barred from subsequent debates because I was tearing up money. So I held my own press conference where I taped up the dollar bills and I spent it and bought lunch with it. And there's all the camera crews there, TV crews, they're interviewing the owner. Did you take that torn up money? He said, yeah, I get torn money all the time. It spends. But it made the guy look like an idiot, and he gave me hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of free advertising. But I do it all the time. It's my trademark.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I like it.
Where were we? I don't know where we were. We were separating society and state. Society is a separate organization, and it provides for the safety net for the poor, and it has nothing to do with the courts. It has nothing to do with can't drive licenses. But it does have one other aspect that we haven't mentioned yet, and that was another aspect of regulation. And I started to touch on it before. There was a banker in town in the book who starts doing fractional reserve banking. So people are depositing silver and gold in his bank, and he's lending it out without their permission. So he does not have 100% of his demand deposits on hand at any given moment. That's theft. But people are coming to Eddie. Eddie, what do? We got to respect the guy's privacy. We can't go into his bank and take his books and look what he's doing. Excuse me. How can we prove that this guy's stealing? Eddie, of course, he doesn't want to initiate the use of force. You have the right to live your life. Banker has the right to live his life. So Eddie says, wait a minute. Why don't we have society, besides from helping out the poor, why not have them set standards for the conduct of business and other affairs of men? So what Eddie does, he goes to Society's Congress and he says, I want you to come up with a banking regulation. And they do, and banking regulation basically says no fractional reserve banking. Now one banker in town, the good banker, he says, he advertises, we comply with all society's rules. We're 100% societally approved. And the other banker, he's like, if he advertises that he's societally approved, well, he's just committed fraud, and we can move against him. And in the guideline that society passes, it says, we're allowed to audit your books. If you claim that you're societally approved, that means we're allowed to come in and audit your books. So the good banker says, come in and look at my books. The bad banker, he doesn't say that. And everybody in town is just like, how come you won't let them audit your books? He's like, well, I. Next thing you know, people pull money out of his bank and he's got to shut down just because he's not following the voluntary rules. Now, he could practice fractional banking if he wanted to. There's no coercion. So the rules for society, again, society has no coercive powers. They can help the poor with donated money. They can regulate businesses, but only if you agree to do it. So there's a butcher shop in town. He takes on cleanliness rules. The hookers in town, it's in Las Vegas where Eddie is. The hookers in town come up with their own John's Bill of Rights, and they advertise that, they guarantee certain cleanliness, certain satisfactions, and everything like that. And again, society does not force anybody to do anything. They just set the standards, and people follow them or not. There are some goody two-shoes who pass a couple of guidelines in society to try and regulate something, and nobody wants to do it. So people advertise 100% societally approved, except we don't follow this one thing. So that means that if you want to have smoking, for example, in your bar, here in the neighborhood here, they don't allow smoking in bars. The government says no smoking, no smoking. Well, if you wanted smoking in your bar, you could do that. If you wanted to practice an interesting form of medicine, you could do that. If you wanted to create some new invention, again, you could do that. And until you step over the line and infringe upon the rights and property of others, until you do that, Jeff, you're free to live your life your way. So there's a way, right there, the three main things. By separating society and state, we can have courts without force, we can have helping the poor without force, we can have business regulations without force. And that's the three main points that I bring out in my book.
Yeah, it's interesting because you say that you don't like to use the word anarchy too much, but it's funny because what you're using is a lot of what I call statist terms. You have to understand our audience here. And I know what's going to happen in the comments down below is a lot of people are going to say, hey, he's talking about having a government because there's going to be a president and a Congress and there's going to be guidelines, but they're all voluntary, so therefore it is still anarchist.
Yes, you can say that. And I've had people say that to me. I don't know if you know Jim Babb. He's one of our local anarchists here, and he picks on me all the time, him and Darren Wolf and a few others. And these guys, I consider them Agoran libertarians because they agree with me, but they keep trying to push me into that status box. Saying, oh, there's a court. Oh, there's shiny badge people. No, no. If the shiny badge guy tackles you and you're not a criminal, he's going to go to jail. He's the one who's going to be standing up in front of court. But they have a channelized view saying, no, no, if you got a president, it's got to be government. It's got to be force.
Yeah, it's funny because like you started bringing it up like you didn't want to use these anarchist terms because you're trying to do these things that you're trying to do, and it's funny because when you're talking to our audience and you say things like president and Congress, they're going to be like, whoa, why is this guy an anarchist? But if it's all voluntary, then it's totally fine. And have you ever read the book Market for Liberty?
I have not. I'm not familiar with the title even. Who wrote that?
Oh, I highly recommend it because what they've done is they've assumed that the world is totally anarchist, and they've come up with ways that things would work. And I think it would really expand some of your ideas on how things could possibly work. And now what you brought up is your ideas on how it could work, and I think it's very interesting. I'd much rather live in your world than today's world. But what I think would happen is in a truly free market, you would see all kinds of ideas. You'd see this town trying these ideas, this town trying these ideas. For example, you brought up that there'd be this jail for a guy with a shiny badge who tackled someone who wasn't a criminal. In another town, they might not even have a jail. They might just say, you owe us this much money. If you don't pay, then everything's done through repayment and I think that's actually a really good way. I think jail in general is a really archaic idea, and it's for the most part doesn't really help much. And all it does is take someone who could be productive and have them sit there and be non-productive for a period of time. But anyway, my whole point is that there's all kinds of amazing ideas that would come out if we would just unstraddle ourselves from this very government centralized, focused idea that we've been living under now for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that repayment idea, because what if I don't want to repay? What are you going to do to me then?
Well, read the book Market for Liberty. There's all kinds of ideas about what you said. It's actually very similar. What they were saying in the book is that everyone would have insurance. And so if you actually aggressed against someone, you would lose your insurance. So exact same way that you were saying, if you did something bad, you would get a non-driving permit or license. What they're saying is you actually have to pay that back. If you don't, your insurance company is going to drop you, and then no one will employ you. You won't be able to live anywhere because no landlord or renter would allow someone to rent their place if they didn't have insurance. So these are all just different, very interesting ways, and I really recommend you read Market for Liberty because what you're doing is in your book at least is you're trying to figure out how it could work, and they've also got other ideas that are different than yours that also could work very well, and it's all very exciting.
As I said, I started with Anarchist. That's what really pulled me away. I started talking to them first, and I've never found anything that really matches up 100%. I mean, I've talked with David Hollis and his contract insurance, and I'm familiar with the insurance approach that you're talking about there. But again, what about the person who doesn't want to participate in it, who's living a good life? Suppose I'm a good guy, and I don't want your insurance, and I just don't care. That's freedom, whether or not I want to do it. Why should I buy into your Jeff Care, or whatever you're going to call your insurance?
Oh, it definitely wouldn't be Jeff Care. But
Eddie has a 100% voluntary approach where you choose for yourself how you're going to live your life.
Well, it'd be interesting. We could talk about these scenarios all day and all night, and this is what anarchists do constantly, of course. But yeah, you could have so someone someone has a lot of money already, and they don't want to live by any of these rules. They'd find fairly quickly that they'd be not making much more money because not many people would want to deal with them because they'd know that this person doesn't respect the rules. They don't have insurance, so there's no guarantee that they're going to, if they break their contract, that they're going to get paid. So there's all sorts of just ways that it would work, and it would all work much better than the system we have today, where almost all the white-collar criminals never get in trouble. No one went to jail over the banking fiasco of 2008, and millions of people are in cages for victimless crimes, which is just a heinous, terrible. This war on drugs is just one of the worst things that's ever happened.
And that's part of my platform. As governor, I would have the power of the pardon, and I'm already promising I will pardon all nonviolent drug offenders my first day in office. I'm also promising to end parole for violent criminals.
That's great, and I've said this a few times on Anarchast that I don't like to be involved at all in the political system. However, I have had on the Libertarian, the the leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada, and she's a good friend of mine, and I support what she's doing. And I try to stay away from it as much as possible, just because I don't like that whole system. And I don't think we can necessarily change the system, and I don't think I wish you all the best of luck. I don't know if you can change the system. I think it's going to have to collapse first. But I do support anyone who is trying to bring more liberty into the world. So I would definitely say, if I lived in Pennsylvania, based on what you've said, that I would definitely vote for you. I think it'd probably be useless. I don't know. What's your like? Where are you in the polls, or do you have any idea? Where did you come in the last elections?
Well, in 2002, I came in a little over 1% with about 42,000 votes. I was the first Libertarian in Pennsylvania for governor to break the 1% barrier. And that was in 2002. We've had no Libertarians running since then because they've been fining us off the ballot. They challenge us, kick us off the ballot, fine us $80,000. That's another story. But one of the main pundits in Pennsylvania says, "Oh, Ken, he's not going to do a whole lot this year. He may get 3-4%." It's like, what? I'm going to quadruple my vote total? And he's like, just? And I just got nominated, what's this, about 2 weeks ago. Today, it's middle of March now. It was the end of February I got nominated. So I'm still gearing up. So if he's already saying I'm going to get 4%, it doesn't take much for me to win. Do you know, it's an off year in Pennsylvania, and typically in a gubernatorial election, only about 30-35% of the people vote. And fewer than half the people are registered to vote. So when you crunch the numbers, all it's going to take for me to win in Pennsylvania in a competitive three-way race, which it's going to be this year, is for me to get the vote of 1 out of 8 voting age Pennsylvanians. If I get the vote of 1 out of 8, that's all it takes. That's going to push me over the top, and I can win. And now after Ron Paul, he has energized the young people. And I'm pulling that in right now because they've never seen anything like this on the governor level before. So I'm like the Ron Paul of Pennsylvania saying, I'm promising you freedom, the right to live your life your way. So that's where I'm planning to get my 12-14% that's going to be that 1 in 8 that's going to push me over the top. So I have a real chance to win this year. And I'm going to veto every tax increase. I'm going to keep the bad guys in jail. I'm going to end asset forfeiture. Right now they catch you with drugs. They take your house, your car, everything. Power is given to me in the Constitution, allow me to just return all forfeited assets. I don't need the legislature's help. I don't need anybody's help. When I get in there, I'm going to be a guy who's going to respect your right to live your life your way. I can't wait. And I'm after saying it now, and people are just like, what? What?
Well, it's very interesting, and we're seeing that happening all over, and you brought up the great point, Ron Paul. He's the one who really changed the game in the last decade, and he woke up so many people. And so many people here on Anarchast, I asked them how they became an anarchist, and they said Ron Paul was the person who turned them over. And so it's very interesting. There's definitely a shift going on right now, and you can see the whole libertarian movement and libertarian idea is becoming so much more mainstream. I'm sure you have some stories about that. I know 10 or 20 years ago, most people didn't even know what that word meant, and today it's a common term on CNN and Fox, and actually a lot of the conservatives are calling themselves libertarians now. They're not libertarians, but they call themselves that because it's such a hip term.
Yeah. You know, my first race was in 1994. I ran for state representative, and I was going door to door, and I'd say, "Hi, I'm a libertarian," and they'd say, "Oh, we're Presbyterian." So those days are gone forever. I mean, now with Rand Paul out there too, I don't agree 100% with Rand Paul, but I agree 90% with him, and that's more than I could say of virtually any other politician ever. And that's what I'm seeing here in Pennsylvania, is that people are just tired of business as usual. They know they're not going to get Social Security. They're tired of seeing their buddies locked up for a joint. 17% of people here in Pennsylvania are in there for drug offenses. That's just ridiculous. I just got a number. Jim Babb just sent me a report from ACLU. We're spending $100 million in Pennsylvania just on pot incarceration alone. That's criminal. And we've got prisons overflowing. We have prison caps here in Pennsylvania, and it's reached the point where we're releasing murderers and rapists from our overcrowded prisons to make room for pot-smoking and Grateful Dead fans. That's insane. I stand in front of a group of students and say that. They cheer. I go in front of a black audience, African-American audience. They know that the judicial system is extremely biased. If for every one white guy who goes to jail, 15 minorities go to jail. And when you look at the 18 to 25-year-old range, it's 55 to 1. Most of them are going to jail for drugs. They know this drug war is a failure. they're not. The government is not letting people live their life their way, and the result is that people are now flocking to the Libertarian banner. Go ahead, I'll let you.
Yeah, we're seeing that all over the place. Of course, Colorado legalized marijuana now. I believe Washington State did. I think even Washington, D.C. Recently did something. So, yeah, there's a lot of changes going on. It's going to be very interesting the next few years what happens. And you brought up the point about how they're letting a lot of the real violent offenders out and keeping these non-violent offenders in. It almost seems like it's a plan or a strategy to really mess up society. Do you think it's actually something they're doing on purpose, or are they just that stupid?
I think they're just that stupid. You know, I've looked at a lot of conspiracy theories. I mean, I remember looking deeply into Oklahoma City. I've looked into Building 7. I've looked at all those things. The government is just not that smart. I mean, when you look at all the other things they do, did they deliberately make such a mess? You mentioned what FEMA did down in New Orleans. Are they deliberately that dumb there and then deliberately that smart somewhere else? It would take thousands of people to be able to pull this off, and I just don't see it. I still have questions, a lot of questions, especially about the plane that theoretically went into the Pentagon, because I didn't see the marks where the engines went through or something like that. So I have questions, but generally speaking, I don't think the government's smart enough to pull these things off.
I disagree a little bit because they're really good at certain things. They're really good at theft. The IRS is incredibly good. You can't get away with anything. They're incredibly good at putting people in cages. So they are very good at some things. And bringing up 9/11, I don't want to talk about it too much, but if you look into that more and more, there's much more to that story than what we know. And so, yeah, it's definitely interesting. But I do, whenever I always lean towards they're more stupid than actually planning these things. But I think there is certain elements of whoever's running government. We don't even really know. Barack Obama definitely doesn't have any say in anything. He's just reads off his teleprompters. Yeah, it's just an amazing time, and bringing up the whole libertarian angle again, it's definitely rising. So it's definitely going to be interesting. We'll definitely get you out there. I know I think you're friends with like Larkin Rose and a lot of people like that. Is that correct?
Neighborhood. Lark and I were probably. He used to be a short walk away, and he just moved about a year or so ago. Now he's a short drive away. But yeah, I know Larkin. I gave him a copy of my book. He hasn't read it yet. I keep saying, Larkin, this is how it works. I like Larkin. He's a good guy.
Yeah, so Larkin was on Anarchast before. I think you also know Josie the Outlaw. She's around your area there as well. So these people have been on Anarchast before, and there's a lot of interesting things going on. I think it's going to be very interesting. I guess so. When is it 2016 that you're going to be running?
No, it's this year.
Oh.
The election is November 4th, 2014. So it's what, 6 months away, 7 months away. So
do you have a website up or anything?
I do. It's kenk.org, kenk.org, because people can't spell kenkrawchuk.com.
Yeah, they went to public school, so.
Yeah, I call them government schools. I never say public schools.
Yeah, I call them indoctrination camps.
Yeah, I know. See, I can't say that. I'm out to get elected, and I'm out to change people's minds, and that's the big thing. And it's funny because I'm running into people from 2002. Like, for example, I was calling Normal. There's a guy who got Normal's endorsement here. He's a Democrat, and he's calling for same thing I am, the decriminalization of marijuana. But they endorsed him for the primary, but he just withdrew. So one of my staffers called down and said, can you endorse Ken now instead? And the woman who answered the phone said, Ken, I saw him in 2002. I was in a grade school, a Catholic grade school, and he came to address our school in 2002, and he was talking about decriminalizing marijuana. I remember him saying about it back then. I'm stunned. There's just so many people I keep running into. Another staffer in Harrisburg for some children's organization, the name escapes me at the moment. She was in the audience at one of the colleges I went to, place after place. I planted all these seeds out there, and now I'm seeing these people are coming up through the ranks. So I'm real optimistic about this year. I know I'm going to blow away my own record, no question about it, from 2002. And it's just good for the future because, like me, once I learned about libertarianism, then you start going beyond that, saying, what's the next stage? A world where people don't initiate the use of force. That's my vision for Pennsylvania, my vision for the country. That's why I'm running, because I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. Because if people keep voting the way they've been voting, they keep on getting just what they've been getting, and I've had enough.
Yep. Well, you have my endorsements. I'm an anarchist, and I'm endorsing you for Pennsylvania governor. I also endorsed Katie, the Libertarian Party leader, Katie Chown in Canada, and I have to admit I have flip-flopped over the years, and I have a question for you after I say this, but originally I was like, I'm not going to ever be involved in the political system. I'll never vote. I'll never do anything. And then I've actually changed a little bit. I've recently got into big time into jury nullification. I think that's one way that we can really affect change, and that's actually you have to be involved in the system to do it, which is unfortunate, but that's one real way you can affect change. And the other one was I was quite against voting. But I've changed on that. I say there's at least one good time to vote, and that's whenever there's a vote to decriminalize something like marijuana. I think that's definitely good to vote for that. And I've really changed too on voting for political parties or anything like that, including the Libertarian Party. I used to say just don't do it, and now I'm saying, you know, especially after talking to someone like yourself, you know, you're so much more on board with freedom and liberty than any politician I've talked to, except I've never talked to Ron Paul, but you'd be pretty much up there with Ron Paul from what I've heard of you, that I do support what you're doing, and we'll definitely be watching. And for all of our viewers who are in that region, definitely get out there and help Ken, and maybe we can have some fun and shake up the system and get rid of some of this horrible, heinous things that are going on.
Now, you mentioned jury nullification, and I just have to point out that that point is in my book. That is how things are decided in court. A jury is randomly selected, and they're the ones who decide the guilt or innocence. Anybody can suggest a sentence, but it's all jury nullification. Everything, all the power in court is centered only in the jury. So that's something.
Yeah, we've got a number of videos, including with Cox. We did one, and we have a jury nullification movement that we've started amongst a number of past Anarchast guests called Just Us Jury Nullification, so people can look that up. And my last question I just want to ask, though, because you're friends with Larkin, and I know he's very anti-voting for anything, is he planning on voting for you?
I would not even start to think about speaking on behalf of anything that Larkin would ever say or do. You know, I value his friendship, him and Tessa. They're great people. I don't even know if he's registered to vote, but you know, I have right there on my laptop all 12 million Pennsylvanians listed there, and I could find out for you. Actually, there's about 8 million registered voters. I could find out for you, but I'm not.
I wouldn't want to invade his privacy, and I'm sure he's not on the list anyway, but I was just curious if he had mentioned anything to you about it.
No, he has not, and you know, when it comes to people on the anarchist edge, I don't ask for an endorsement, because to quote the book that I'm reading right now, P.J. O'Rourke book, is don't vote, it only encourages the bastards. So I'm not going to insult somebody like Larkin and say, are you going to vote? Are you going to vote? You know, what are you? Oh, it's like asking a Catholic if they're going to have some Satan worship or something like that.
Yeah, that's totally true. So maybe you can let us know where people can get your book and anything else you'd like to say, and we'll finish up.
Okay, well, you can always go to my governor website. There's a link from there it's kenk.org, kenk.org. And the book is called Atlas Snubbed, not Shrugged, Snubbed, S-N-U-B-B-E-D. And of course, there's an atlassnubbed.com. But if you can't remember that, just go Atlas Shrugged parody and Google. I come up either the first hit or the second hit.
Yeah, that's great. It sounds like it's sort of like the anarchist version of Atlas Shrugged as opposed to the objectivist version. So very interesting. So we'll be interested to see if some people get out there and read that and see how much support you get there in Pennsylvania. I wish you the best of luck and keep spreading freedom and nonviolence and the non-aggression and totally voluntary transactions. So that's Ken Krawchuk coming in from Pennsylvania, and I'm Jeff Berwick here for Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. Peace, love, and anarchy.
This is Anarchast.